Hey friends, it's your old pal Flooko here again. So this time, I've got a landscape painting time-lapse for you. And just like the last painting I did, you can see I always start with the background color. I try and pick one that I basically feel like it's the medium or median color of the whole painting sort of thing, like the overall color. And for this one, it would have been blue. So for every painting I do, I like to work in layers, and this one is no exception. So the furthest layer back would actually be this sunsetty sky I have going on. So I'm trying to just block that in here, and I'm using the biggest, fluffiest brush I've got so that I can cover more ground quicker. Now for those of you who are interested in the actual colors I'm using, the blue I've got going on here is called Ocean Blue, which I'm actually using for the first time. I haven't used this specific blue yet. It looks really, really nice. And that's what I'm using for the clouds here. And underneath that blue, I've got a lighter one called Bahama Blue. It kind of gives it that teal, sort of turquoisey look. The pink I've got going on is Carousel Pink, and the yellow is Saffron Yellow. And the really bright strip I have on there where the sunset would be setting, it's not actually white that I put in there. I put in some, it's called buttermilk, so it's a bit of a creamier looking white. Now here you can see I'm working on this bed of clouds here, so this is a little bit tricky because I knew I wanted them to look really soft, and if I just used my paint on there as it is, it would just look a little too sharp. So I knew I wanted to build it up, make it look kind of soft, so by doing that, I took some highlight color, I added some water in with it, really watered it down so it was almost see-through, and I would put a little layer of that on. I'd let it dry, and then I'd build up another little layer of that on there, but in a smaller space, and it slowly starts to feather in, kind of, where the highlights look like they gradually come in rather than just big solid streak I have in there. It takes a while because of all the drying time, but it's always worth it in the end. It always looks pretty nice and soft and cloud-like, I should say, which is what I was going for. This footage here I actually love. My buddy Chris does a really awesome job of filming these things. He always has film cameras and things because he works in the film industry, so when he's got a sweet one he lets me know, so he comes over and helps me film these things. So here I know I'm mixing some colors because I'm about to make a big decision here where I'm going to start blocking in the big foreground stuff, and that's always a little bit nerve-wracking because I'm basically covering over parts of my painting that I've already spent time on, and it's one of those things where you gotta kind of be sure where you're putting your paint because you really don't want to have to repaint in a mistake or something. And then when I have a background like this where there's lots of gradients and things, like I don't think I can just go in and patch that up because it's just going to be really noticeable. So for these things I almost sketched them out first, roughly at least. This one I didn't. I probably should have just to save some anxiety, but I just went for it, followed my gut, my instincts there, and it ended up looking pretty good right off the bat as far as composition goes. It's actually parts like this where I was mentioning in my last video where it's really good to step back, like every, not even every couple minutes, every few seconds, kind of step back and just get the overall picture of what you're doing here, because when you're working on this tight little area like this, you lose track of the bigger picture, so it's always good to step back, see what you're actually doing as far as composition goes. Here I see I'm mixing in some orange, so this is actually one of my favorite parts. So now that I've got a big dark block of color in here for my foreground, I know that's going to be my mountain. So this is really fun where you get to kind of go in with your highlights and actually sculpt out like the form of the whole rock. So here, as soon as I put that orange on, you can tell, oh, that's the top. That's where someone could be standing or something. The light's hitting up here. And all of a sudden, things just instantly become a little bit more 3D, which is really fun. I'm just working it in here. And I know I keep bringing up my last video a lot, but I also said in that one, if you're using anything orange, I found that I just added a little bit of red into it and things just looked amazing. And I did the same thing here, so I kind of took my own advice, added some red in with my orange, and it just makes the nicest color. Like, as you can see here, you can even tell, like, as soon as you do that, it's like, ooh, that looks good with the blue. Here's another favorite part of mine, adding in some vegetation. As soon as I've got my rough, rocky layout going on in there, it's like, okay, time to bring this to life. Let's put some plant life and things in here. And this is another one where I just use a big, fluffy brush. I kind of, instead of wiping on the paint, I almost stab it a little bit because the bristles themselves add some detail in there with how they hit the canvas. So I always start with a light, like the lighter color green, block and everything, and then I'll add a little bit of black to that stab it a bit with my paintbrush and come in and add in that darker color where you'd kind of only paint on the middle parts of the plants, and it gives that a 3D sort of backlit looking look. This is when I was starting to put too much green, and I was like, okay, I gotta break up this plants a little bit. So what I did, I took that same ocean blue color that I had in the sky, and I mixed that in with the green and made some plants that color. And as you can see here, it actually really broke it up pretty nicely. It gave the vegetation some randomness. It didn't make it look so uniform, more natural. Here I can see I'm actually putting in some highlights now. Paintings are just like a sculpture, you know? You just chip away at it. The more you add, the more shadows you add, the more highlights you add. Things become more lifelike and more 3D, and you start to get a better sense of the whole space and the world. And so for these plants, anytime you do a highlight on them, almost without fail, all you really have to do is take whatever green you're using and just add a little bit of yellow to it. And then you'd put that on the edges, the top edges where the sun be hitting, and as you can see here, it starts to really make it look 3D, which is pretty cool. Here also, I take some black paint, I really water it down. I start to add that in underneath each plants. Oh, here's the dreaded paintbrush selection, where I've just got too many to choose from, where I'm like, which one am I going to use? It's funny that you actually feel me have my eureka moment. Oh, this one. My favorite part, I just love getting to this stage where you're just putting in little highlights and adding all the contrast in, because that's when everything really starts to come to life. The lighting starts to really show, and I don't know, just gives everything some character and some depth to it. Once again, all I really did was just add a little bit of that exact same yellow that I had in the sky, which is the saffron yellow. And then that means that the highlights these plants are getting are from the same shade that's coming from the sky, which is what's coming from the sun. And you don't want to just have like 100 different colors you're using. I usually, with every painting, I almost have maybe 4 or 5 colors tops, and I keep the painting in that same realm. It keeps everything uniform. It looks like everything's being lit by the same thing. If you just throw in some colors that just don't match at all, it's just going to look wrong and off. Like when you keep a certain color palette, it almost looks like you color corrected your painting. Like it all just looks like it all fits in the same world. It's just nicer to look at. Now here we go, adding in a bit more highlights and things. Honestly, one of my favorite things. Because I know if I'm adding in highlights, that means that I'm getting close to the end of the painting, because this is usually one of the last things I put in. Of all the parts of this painting, this is actually the section that gave me the most trouble, because I didn't really have a plan for this. I just knew if I chipped away at it, you know, like sculpt it, like I said earlier, because like I said, paintings are basically just sculptures too, just a different kind. I just knew if I worked at it long enough, it would eventually take shape. Here I go again, just adding some highlights to the clouds here. Painting skies has always just been one of my favorite things to do. I don't know what it is. I can't even go for walks because I find I just stop and I'm just staring at the clouds like I look like a crazy person. I almost want to tell them, I'm like, no, I'm getting references for my paintings. I'm not psycho. Here we go, just trying to mix up the perfect colors here. She's slowly starting to come together here. This is when you get all excited too, when the paintings you're working on, when it doesn't just look like a blob of colors anymore. We're like, oh, all these forms are taking shape. So as you can see with a lot of my paintings, I start off really rough. Like I just blob in all these colors, because when I'm using this big brush and I've got all this wet paint on there, it's really easy for things to blend, and you get some nice gradients without even really trying too hard, just because the paint's wet, so it's all working together. If you let it dry, you get a little bit streaky. It just doesn't look as solid, doesn't look as nice. Here we go, just adding in some more orange and highlights, trying to get this rock face here where the sun's hitting it, trying to get a bit more 3D, more detailed. The more highlights and shadows you put in, you get to get a better sense of the terrain. And that's really fun too. Just like, I don't plan those parts out, because I think it's really fun to, as you're painting, you're like, oh, maybe I'll put a little path here. Oh, you know what, maybe I'll put some steps here. Maybe there's a little ramp here. That's what keeps it really fun and interesting. It's like you're creating a world in real time with as your brain and mind just kind of leads the way. It's one of the funnest things to do, and I just love that when you're done, you end up with a physical object that someone else can enjoy too and put up on their wall, and you had fun making the whole thing. So Oh, here we go, adding in some more highlights and shadows on the rocks here. And you really got to think about this too, where I often put a chair in front of my canvas and I'll just sit on it and stare at that painting. I'll be like, okay, where is the sun in this painting? I think it's probably over here. So all you have to do is just think to yourself, like physically, what would the sun actually be hitting and what would be in shadow? And if you just think about it, like it's not so tricky to add that all in there. Like, just like, well, this would be shadow, we'll make it shadow. And half the time you can, just by using your imagination and just some know-how and some common sense, you're like, okay, this looks pretty good. Just putting things where you think it should be. Like whatever makes actual physical sense. Here we go, I'm still working on, at this point still, I still wasn't happy with this part of the painting, so as you can tell, I think I worked on this little area the most, and it's probably the least interesting, but it took the most work to get it looking cool. Oh, here I was getting really excited too, because I knew this painting was almost finished. You can't tell, but this is like 1,000,000 hours I put into this thing, but just sped up to be, what is this video, probably like 15 minutes. Yeah, this is cool. Just putting in this little bench here. My little signature Flooko bench. This is another little part where I'm just like, please don't screw this up. Because anytime I'm putting a little 3D object in there, like the orientation of it all, it's really easy to just have it be a little bit off. And the whole time, that's all you're looking at. It's like, that's not the right angle. So I'm glad I think I got it pretty good on the first try here. This is where I'm putting in all my shading and things. And as you can see too, I rough it in, blocks of color pretty much. And then I'll go in with my much smaller brush and clean up the edges and everything, make it look nicer. Here I'm just putting in some shadows. Doing my old finger smear technique that I do sometimes. Keep in mind, I said this in the other video too, but when you're using your finger like that to smear in some paint, you don't want to have too much paint on there because you'll actually just make a total mess. I had barely any on there when I was doing it. It's the only way that'll work. Yeah, I'm just putting in some highlights and things. Helps it stand out a bit more. It also makes it look a lot sharper. When you put some light edges mixed with the black edges, it just makes it pop up really good. Oh, you can see I messed that part up. Redid it, looks better now. And that's about that. I think I might have added a little bit more details after, but that's pretty much it. I actually really love how this one turned out. So I hope that wasn't too boring for you and you guys had fun watching that, and I hope my voice didn't drive you nuts. Well, hopefully this inspired some of you out there for your own future projects and paintings. Until next time, I hope you guys have a wonderful day, and stay tuned for the next one.